and bump over to here. Okay, so for endocrine system, we have been introduced to endocrine system in little bits throughout our time together, right? So each time we get to a system, we're like, okay, how is the system controlled and coordinated? We're talking about, oh, nervous, extrinsic control, hormonal, extrinsic control, and then there's usually some sort of intrinsic control, right? And so we've learned that hormones are produced by endocrine glands. They're released into the bloodstream, and they travel around the body, and they are a chemical messenger that can then tell certain cells of certain tissues of certain organs when to do something, right? Just like a neurotransmitter can, but these ones go long distances, and they're going to light up or stimulate a cell that has the correct complementary shaped receptor on its cell surface, so it can receive that message if it has the right shaped receptors, right? That's how we have specificity in here, because if we dump these hormones into the bloodstream, how come every cell in the body doesn't light up? Because we have the bloodstream going everywhere. That's the whole idea of it, right? Is that it goes everywhere. So we have certain hormones that will stimulate certain cells that have those receptors. And we have been introduced to certain endocrine glands along the way. We're like, oh, pancreas, right? We have pancreatic islets. There were some in there. We talked about the heart. Oh, there is atrial natriuretic peptide that comes from the heart. So we talked a little bit about that as an endocrine organ. We talked about stomach, etc., and small intestine. But we also focused on some of the primary organs of the endocrine system, like the pituitary gland, as we were talking about in lab before, and hypothalamus and stuff like that. So as we go through this, what we're going to be doing is first, like usual, introducing endocrine system overall, like what's the system and how does it make these hormones and things like that. And then it'll be the tour. We'll go through the major endocrine organs, what hormones they put out, and what those hormones do. So a bit like we did in lab, but we'll of course be adding a little bit more detail to that. Okay, so we'll do that kind of tour like that. All right. So we have discussed how hormones are chemical messengers, for sure, right? So these hormones are just like our neurotransmitters, but they're going long distances. And because they go into the bloodstream and they circulate around for a period of time, they may have longer lasting effects too. Rather than just like a muscle twitch or something, these hormones are going to be circulating around for a while, so we tend to have longer lasting effects. So they can do things like help to regulate the extracellular fluid, regulate metabolism, the biological clock in terms of development, things like that, right? We talk about teenage years and hormones raging and things like that. Contraction of some of our muscle that is involuntary rather than voluntary, right? Glandular secretion, where we're communicating with other endocrine glands as well as exocrine glands, saying, hey, knocking on the door, telling them though it's their time to release their own secretions, and even some immune functions as well. So a variety of different things that hormones are going to regulate the timing of and the amount of activity that those cells are going to produce. So similar to the nervous system, but longer lasting. Maybe it takes a little bit longer for the stimulation to occur because we have to drop it into the blood and have to get through the blood to get there and then be received by the cell. But then also the effects are generally longer lasting as well, right? So our neurotransmitters are responding in terms of like milliseconds, seconds or something like that-ish, whereas this type of response, the response tends to be more like on minutes to hours to days, and it lasts, or even longer than that. So it lasts a bit more time. So just a refresher in terms of how that tends to work, comparing it to exocrine glands. Remember that exocrine glands are going to have a duct or a little pipe that drains their secretion into the local area, right? So like a salivary gland or a sweat gland or something like that. Meanwhile, endocrine glands, their secretions are only hormones. So they put out hormones that are not releasing into a duct. Endocrine glands are ductless systems. They release into the blood, and the blood is transporting their secretion. So right here we see a list of certain endocrine glands that we are going to be touring through. As we saw in the lab, pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, attached to the thyroid, right? Adrenal glands, also called the suprarenal glands, because they are superior to the kidneys, right? Renal means kidneys. That was what we learned in the urinary system. So sometimes they're called the suprarenal glands now, and then the pineal glands, which that may be familiar as we went through the brain before, and how the pineal gland is a gland that's attached to the brain that helps to regulate our sleep-wake cycle. And then we also are going to discuss the hypothalamus again, because the hypothalamus is a key structure of the body that helps to regulate homeostasis in various ways, but it straddles the line between nervous and endocrine, right? So a lot of these endocrine organs are not exclusive one thing or another, like you said, like the heart, like the stomach. And here we have a part of the brain that is neural tissue, but in fact, it produces and then ultimately releases hormones as well. So a neuron that creates a hormone is going to be endocrine and neural. And then we mentioned how there's a variety of other organs around the body that have a primary function in one system, but then they have a smaller level function in the endocrine system, like the pancreas, right? Most of it is exocrine in function. Like the gonads that we're going to be learning in reproductive system that are about gamete production, sex cell production, but they also produce hormones, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, etc. And even the placenta, which helps to regulate some of the mother's reproductive physiology as kind of a feedback mechanism too. So a variety of different kind of shared function organs in the body too. We'll primarily focus on the new ones that we haven't addressed before, up towards the top there, but we've seen some of these endocrine glands show up from time to time in other systems of the body. Even the kidneys, right? So we talked about, right, renin being released from the kidneys, etc. Okay, so this diagram just kind of shows us a very basic depiction of how endocrine glands work. So we're going to have an endocrine cell that produces some sort of a hormone, releases it from the cell, gets picked up by the bloodstream, transported to those target cells that have the complementary shape receptor on it. Now, how is it that these endocrine glands with those endocrine cells know when it's time to be able to secrete those hormones, right? So with the nervous system and the endocrine system, those are the bosses of the body. So who's the boss of the boss, right? There's got to be this whole hierarchy, etc. So we'll find that there are different feedback mechanisms that allow the endocrine organs to know when it's time to release, how much to release, etc. And this is all about messages. So we want to make sure the message is getting through. It's one thing for you to talk to somebody. So you're doing your part, in terms of communicating, but they have to be listening as well. And so those cells, as we talked about, have to have the receptor to receive the message as well. And in fact, those receptors can be as numerous as multiple thousand, even up to 100,000 different types of receptors per target cell. And that's to allow them to receive different types of messages. So the same cell can receive messages from different endocrine glands, from different hormones, etc. It's got to be able to pick up those different messages at different times. Now, the receptors on the target cell are what allow us, they're like the ears of the cell that allows that cell to receive the message. But just like our own hearing, it can be selective, right? So if you are at your job and you're communicating to people, or if you're a parent and you're communicating to kids or something like that, again, it's one thing for you to say it, it's another thing for them to hear it, hear the message, right? And even act on the message. And the cells in the body are kind of like that too. So the number of receptors that we have on a cell that receive that message can vary. So we can actually down-regulate or decrease the sensitivity of those cells by pulling in those different types of receptors. So you may hear, your kids or your underlings at work or something like that, they may complain when you are just always yelling at them. They tend to then tune you out, right? Because they're like, oh, yeah, they're going on again about this particular topic, how we have to, right, make sure the break room's clean or something like that. So if they get too much of that message, and the message is too loud or something like that, they tend to tune it out, right? Our cells of our body can also tune their hearing So if we pull in those receptors, then it's going to be less sensitive to that hormone. And so that's what downregulation is. We decrease the number of receptors, which decreases that sensitivity. In addition, we can increase their sensitivity in the opposite way, right? So we can create more receptors, put them on the surface, and that way, if there's very little hormone, right? If somebody's whispering, then you're like, oh, I got to pay attention. I got to like maybe turn my ear towards them to make sure that I'm getting the signal. So if there's a deficiency in hormone instead, or not much stimulation, then the cells may upregulate instead. So they physiologically adapt to make sure that they're still getting their message. So it becomes more sensitive instead. Okay, a few other things about those messages getting through to cells. We talked about at the top there the typical situation of endocrine cells targeting these distant cells around the body, but there's a variety of other types of communication systems or chemical messenger systems in the body as well, even outside of neurotransmitters. So there are other types of what we call local hormones too. So a peregrine, you see it in the lower left-hand corner there, a peregrine is going to be where a cell within the organ will release chemical messages that will affect nearby cells of that same organ, right? So remember we have gastrin. And so gastrin is going to be released by G cells within the stomach, and it is going to stimulate other cells in the stomach wall, right? Chief cells, parietal cells, stuff like that. Now, gastrin does go into the bloodstream, and it goes further distances too, but peregrine is where we are affecting nearby cells. And then, in fact, some cells can respond to their own message, right? So, like, for instance, epinephrine or something like that, most cells in the body will respond to adrenaline. In a stressful situation, they need to be able to respond. Whether it's slow down or speed up or something like that, they need to respond to a stressful situation. So there are some cells that can stimulate themselves. It's probably not their primary target, but that is called autocrine, where they're stimulating themselves instead. Okay. So we talked generically about how our endocrine cells will produce these messages that will then go to target cells that have the receptors that can receive the message as well. And when we're talking about the creation of those hormones, different cells from different endocrine glands can produce those hormones from different kind of starting materials. And so what we have is two major chemical classes of hormones. And one of them is called lipid-soluble hormones. And as you might imagine, this is also called hydrophobic, right? Because we know oil and water doesn't mix. So these are sometimes called hydrophobic hormones. And then we're also going to have water-soluble hormones that are going to be the opposite, right? They're going to be hydrophilic, water-loving hormones instead. And so as we go through the different chemical classes of hormones, we'll talk about how they're created and how they're transported in the blood and things like that. We have to keep these two main chemical classes in mind: lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones. This is one of those exam objectives where, and in fact, I'm going to try to do my grading, prioritized grading of exams this week. But I'll try to go through the exam objectives as well, like I did for the last couple, and try to clean them up and make sure that they are very sleek and efficient. But I can tell you that this is going to be, and right now is, one of our bold exam objective questions. A possible short answer question where it says, tell me about the two different chemical classes of hormones and kind of compare and contrast them. Okay? So here's our two categories: lipid-soluble, water-soluble. And with our lipid-soluble, we have some examples like steroid hormones, which on the one hand, you're like, ooh, steroids, those are bad. We'll discuss that. Not bad. As with anything, too much of something or used inappropriately can be bad, but the substance itself is not bad. So steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, there are certain thyroid hormones that are also lipid-soluble, and some kind of local ones like nitric oxide, etc. And then water-soluble, these are going to be amines, peptides, proteins. These are different types of polar molecules that will then get along with water, and we'll talk about that group as well. So here's some examples of our lipid-soluble hormones. And in fact, most of our lipid-soluble hormones are going to be the steroid hormones. And steroid hormones are going to be those that are based on cholesterol. So when we look at this part of this molecule here, where we see those 4 rings all attached to one another, that is cholesterol. And again, cholesterol, you're like, oh, cholesterol bad. We don't want any cholesterol. We most assuredly do want some cholesterol. It's embedded within our plasma membranes of our cells, and there's whole chemical classes of hormones that require cholesterol. You have to have it. So with steroid hormones, we have that as a base model, cholesterol, and then it depends on what functional groups we have attached to it as to what hormone, specific hormone it is. What we're seeing right there is aldosterone. What do we learn about aldosterone? What does aldosterone do? So it tells the kidneys to reabsorb sodium, right? It is a steroid hormone. It's based off of cholesterol. So obviously, the ones you might think of, what are going to be some other steroid hormones that you know of, even without knowing endocrine system yet? If people are on steroids, what is it typical of? Somebody's doing like weightlifting or something like that, and they're injecting steroids. Testosterone is the main one, right? So the anabolic effects, the building effects of a steroid hormone, that one, we're really talking about testosterone. So steroids is a class of hormones that are based on cholesterol. It includes testosterone, it includes progesterone and estrogen and things like that, and aldosterone. So there's a number of different examples of lipid-soluble hormones that are steroids, not just testosterone, right? So that's kind of a misnomer that people hear about. They hear that word steroids and they're thinking it's just one thing. It's a one category of a thing, of a chemical class of hormones based on cholesterol. Most of our steroid hormones end in ONE like that, right? Testosterone, progesterone, aldosterone. There's ones called corticosterone, also a short name of cortisol. So those are all steroid hormones like that. And like I mentioned, it all depends on what's attached to the cholesterol as to whether it is one chemical or another. Yeah?
Did you include estrogen in there?
Estrogen's in there too, yeah. It's always one of those things, right? We say that there's a rule, like this is how it works, etc., and then there's always exceptions to the rule, unfortunately, right? But yeah, estrogen counts as one as well. And then, again, in terms of lipid-soluble hormones, most of your examples are steroids, but then there's also some of our thyroid hormones. So these are hormones that come from the thyroid gland. Luckily for us, they're just called thyroid hormones. We'll learn their chemical classes. But you can see, look at the structure of it. Look at the chemical structure. It's not based off of cholesterol. It doesn't have those 4 rings like that. But it is lipid soluble, and that's what this chemical class is. So the thyroid hormones, T3, T4, that regulate metabolism, they are also lipid soluble. They're not based on cholesterol. They're not a steroid hormone, but they are lipid soluble, so they would be an example in this chemical category that we see here. Contrast that with different examples of water-soluble hormones. We said that these are going to be amines, peptides, proteins, etc. So some of the most popular ones that you've heard of are like epinephrine or norepinephrine, adrenaline or noradrenaline. So once upon a time, adrenaline was the name for that hormone. And then some pharmaceutical company, I don't remember which one, came up with a product that had a name that was very much like adrenaline. And they didn't want people to mix it up with the actual hormone with their particular product. And so they changed the name to epinephrine. Epinephrine, norepinephrine. But it comes from the adrenal medulla, and it is an example of a water-soluble hormone, right? So is things like insulin and glucagon, stuff like that. Those are your new water-soluble hormones as well. And you can see, right, amino acids linked together are what are commonly the structure for these water-soluble hormones. Okay, 2 chemical classes. We have examples of both chemical class now. Now we know that as hormones, they need to be transported in the blood, but the main fluid of the blood, plasma, is made up of what? So there are proteins in there. What's the fluid part of plasma? What is that? Water, right? Plasma is mostly water. So you can imagine water-soluble hormones are going to have an easy time floating along in the plasma, right? When we harken back to the beginning of the semester, we said that the plasma contains all kinds of things in it. Nutrient molecules, respiratory gases, ions, waste products, etc., and hormones. Hormones floating around in the plasma for transport, right? Water-soluble hormones are going to have no problem going around the plasma because they get along with water Meanwhile, lipid-soluble hormones, oil and water don't mix, they're going to need some assistance, okay? So for transporting the hormones in the blood, the protein hormones are in their free form in the blood. Steroid and thyroid hormones must be attached to a transport protein. A protein is typically water-soluble. So if we have lipid-soluble, it's not getting along, we attach it to the plasma protein, and now that plasma protein, which is water-soluble, can get it through the plasma to the target cell. So it makes them more water-soluble that way. It also, because it's attached to a protein and now it's bigger, it tends to keep it in the bloodstream a little bit longer as well, because it's a bigger molecule, so it's not going to drop through that glomerular filter that we've been learning about as well. Okay? So that's the way that our lipid-soluble hormones have to be transported in the blood, attached to a transport protein. Okay, so we have that way to compare and contrast those two. So that kind of creates a reserve, like we mentioned, of that hormone. It delivers it around to the target tissues, and then it dissociates from the plasma protein. And then we have our free fraction of that lipid-soluble hormone that's going to stimulate those target cells. Okay, so now we've gotten those hormones, whether it be lipid-soluble or water-soluble. We've got it to the target cell. Now, how is it going to find its receptor? Where are those receptors going to be located between lipid-soluble and water-soluble? So we need to think about it. We're getting to the target cell. Target cell has a plasma membrane. Plasma membrane is mostly made up of what? Lipids, right? Phospholipid. It's a lipid bilayer. So now, when we look at water-soluble versus lipid-soluble hormones, we're seeing a flip in terms of which one's easier for accessing. When we were transporting through the plasma, water-soluble is like, I love it here. Lipid-soluble is like, ooh, I'm kind of afraid in here. I need an escort. Now when we get to the target cell, it's lipid-soluble hormones that are like, ooh, this is very easy. Like for like, I can get through the plasma membrane, no problem. Meanwhile, water-soluble can't really get into the cell. It's stuck at the surface. So where are the receptors going to be located then, right? So the receptors are going to allow us to get that signal. It's going to tell the cell whether it needs to respond by creating new molecules or changing the permeability of the membrane or changing its metabolic reactions, etc. But in a lipid-soluble hormone, look, there's the blood vessel up there, like a capillary or something like that. We can see that little red thing, if you will, is a transport protein that has escorted it along. And now that free hormone, that free lipid-soluble hormone, is exiting our capillary and arriving at our really huge target cell. And what it does is it slips right through that plasma membrane. It slips right through the nuclear membrane, and it binds with receptors associated with the DNA. Okay? So where are the receptors for lipid-soluble hormones? Receptors for lipid-soluble hormones are actually going to be inside of the nucleus of the cell. Not only inside the cell, but inside the nucleus. So think about it, right? The DNA is the cookbook that tells this cell what to do. It has all the genes, and the genes will code for certain metabolic processes, making certain proteins, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we want that message to get. That's the most direct communication. So we have receptors associated with the DNA inside of the nucleus, that where that message is going to finally stimulate that target cell. Now, if we contrast that with our water-soluble, there we see water-soluble hormones having no problem going around in the plasma up at the top, right? Up along here. But when it gets to the target cell, it cannot get across that phospholipid membrane. So its receptors are located right at the surface of the cell instead. Okay, so the cell has, quote-unquote, received the signal at this point, but the cellular machinery, the organelles, and in fact, things like the endoplasmic reticulum, etc., isn't going to be able to get that signal if we just leave it right at the surface of the cell. That's like, right, knocking on the door, but we have to have some sort of response inside the cell. So what we have in these cells that are receiving our water-soluble hormones, they have a second messenger system. So the receptor finding that hormone is the first message, right? The first message is going to get there and stimulate the cell itself. But we rely on second messengers to relay that signal deeper and deeper into the cell. So for instance, there are G proteins associated with a receptor. we're going to see ATP being converted to cyclic AMP. That's our second messenger right there. Cyclic AMP then activates some protein kinases. These are enzymes, ASE, right? These protein kinases are going to phosphorylate different types of proteins, and then those proteins then may end up having some sort of physiological activity in response, right? So there's a series of steps that are going to be involved that will then allow the cell to respond. It relies on a second messenger system. Number one, to relay that message into the cell where the cell can have a response. But number two, and here we can see that relay. Oh, look, they're having fun, passing the baton, etc., right? So not only does that receive the message from the surface and get it deeper into the cell, and again, I'm not having you know, oh, what's the second messenger here? What is the active, agent along this pathway, etc. Just that the second messenger system gets the signal inside the cell. But then also the importance of this is that a relay system, a second messenger system, can amplify the cellular response as well. Because each of those different steps where the baton, if you will, is passed from one to another, it's not necessarily one individual molecule to another. It can be one activates 100 molecules in the next step. And those 100 then activate 1,000 in the next step. And so we get this big amplification, right? An amplifier in a sound system increases the sound quite a bit, right? And so that's what we're seeing here is increasing the cellular response. So a second messenger system, not only does it get the message inside the cell, but it increases the response. So we may start with one molecule of epinephrine or something like that, and we end up converting 10 to the 8th, like 100 million glycogen store molecules to glucose in order to free up glucose stores in this stressful situation, right? Epinephrine, adrenaline is a stressful situation. We need a lot of glucose all of a sudden. So we can see where at certain places, right, there's 100, there's 10,000, there's 100,000, there's 1,000,000, etc. So each one of those steps in the relay can amplify or increase the signal. So that's the other benefit of having a second messenger system. Okay? And that only occurs with our messenger system, which means that it only occurs in response to water-soluble hormones. So lipid-soluble hormones don't have that same second messenger system and ways to amplify our signal. Okay, so what we've explained there so far is two chemical classes of hormones, how they are created, what they're created from, how they're transported in the blood, how they stimulate their target cell. Okay, we're just looking at one molecule at a time, one hormone, whether it's lipid-soluble or water-soluble, what happens in terms of its pathway. But we said that those cells commonly will have thousands and thousands and thousands of receptors so they can receive signals and messages from lots of different hormones. So what happens when they are stimulated in different ways? We can have interactive effects. So not just one response, but we can have different types of responses based on how many hormones and what hormones are stimulating them at the time. So these are the different interactive effects. Permissive effect, synergistic effect, and the antagonistic effect. And looking at those names, you can probably figure out what some of these are doing when more than one hormone arrives. So the first one, the permissive effect, effectively is saying, oh, this is one hormone giving the cell permission to be affected by the other one, strengthen the effect of the other hormone that is arriving. So for instance, thyroid hormone, which affects metabolism, strengthens epinephrine's kind of metabolic effects. So lipolysis, if you look at that, that has to do with lipids. When we burn lipids to give us more energy, like glucose and things like that, if you have both of those hormones stimulating the cell, epinephrine is going to have that effect on cells. But if we have thyroid hormone also stimulating the cell, that increases metabolism for cells in the body. So together, it's going to strengthen the effect on the cell. So they work together. So the thyroid effectively gives permission for the epinephrine of the cell to respond even more to epinephrine's stimulation. Synergistic effect is where when we have some sort of metabolic goal in mind, it requires more than one hormone to get there. So they need to work together, synergistic, they're working together in synergy. And so, for instance, when we're talking about oocyte production, what's an oocyte? Early lab people heard about those. It's an egg, right? So we're getting the reproductive system. So this is the female gamete, the oocyte. In order to produce oocytes, it requires both estrogen and LH, which is called luteinizing hormone, right? So we're going to develop our eggs, and we need to also then ultimately kind of release them as well. And it takes those two hormones to do it. In fact, it takes a few hormones even beyond that. So they have a synergistic effect. They work together for a common goal. And then finally, we have antagonistic effects, where the hormones have opposite effects on the cell. So this will be like gas pedal and brake. It's like sympathetic and parasympathetic that have commonly opposite effects. So for instance, insulin and glucagon, which both come from the pancreas, insulin causes our blood glucose levels to drop. Glucagon causes our blood glucose levels to increase instead. They have the opposite effects. So if you're releasing them at the same time, the cell is a little bit conflicted, right? It's kind of like trying to accelerate while having the brake on. But they have opposite effects overall. And there are more hormones that have opposite effects as well, but that's a common example. Okay. So now we've explained how cells can receive that information and how, if we have more than one hormone, how it may affect the cell's performance as well. One of the final general topics that we go through in terms of how hormones work is how these endocrine glands know when it's time to release those hormones. And if we look at it, like with any system in the body, where we're like, okay, so how is the system coordinated and controlled? Neural control, hormonal control. Those are the same, even for this control system, it's the same type of control for it, overarching control. So there's going to be neural stimulation, hormonal stimulation, and then the last one is humoral control. So a humor is a fluid, if you remember. So remember how we had aqueous humor and vitreous humor and stuff like that in the eye? So the humors of the body can have direct control over an endocrine gland. So that means that an endocrine gland may have receptors that are monitoring, for instance, the blood. That's one of the main humors, the fluids of the body, monitoring the blood for a certain substance. Is that substance getting low? Is it too high? Do I need to make a change, right? So for glucose, like we were just talking about, for insulin and glucagon, the pancreas has receptors that can check glucose levels directly in the fluid and then respond accordingly. So that's a type of control as well. So in any of the cases, it's going to be a negative feedback mechanism where we have a set point and we're going to be monitoring it to see, is the current situation in alignment with the set point, or is it too far away from it and we need to make a change? But what we're trying to do is make sure that it stays within a normal range, close to that set point for the most part. So typical negative feedback. Now there are some cases where positive feedback comes into play. This is something that we discussed in the very first chapter of our whole sequence of Bio 201, 202. Homeostasis is mostly regulated by negative feedback, where we nudge it back to where the set point is. But positive feedback, we do have one of our main examples of positive feedback here when we're talking about labor and childbirth, because what's going to happen here is there's going to be a hormone that's released called oxytocin, which stimulates the smooth muscle within the uterine wall to do those contractions. And when those contractions occur, there's a feedback mechanism that goes back to the hypothalamus, and it says, oh, how do you like those contractions? How about some more, right? So stretch receptors will tell, as a feedback mechanism, it'll tell us that, oh, the baby's there, and the muscular walls of the uterus are right up against it, and we're being stretched. And so when those contractions are occurring, it is then causing those stretch receptors to go off more. So they tell the hypothalamus, hey, I'm being stretched more, and the hypothalamus responds by, here's some more oxytocin. So now harder contractions, more intense and more frequent. So then that feedback loop keeps going, keeps going. But the key aspect there is that we are going from having one set point where we're maintaining two individuals for about 9 months, and we are now going back to a different set point where we're maintaining one individual again. So we're changing the set point. Rather than nudging it back to the same set point, any deviation from the set point, we're pushing it back. Now we're actually changing the set point. So we're kind of pushing it away from that set point instead. Okay. So as you can imagine, where we have a control system like the endocrine system, it's overseeing a lot of the other systems. If you have a problem with the endocrine system, there can be very large effects in the body because it's a trickle-down effect. If at your job, you've got a boss that has some sort of an issue, if your boss is sick or just doesn't manage properly or something like that, it has cascading effects, right, throughout all the workers in the store or whatever, right? So if the endocrine system or the nervous system has a problem, the whole body can have a problem. And so hypersecretion, too much hormone, hyposecretion, too little hormone, can have some big effects around the body. Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say that they happen. We'll have some different examples through time of that.
Would it be like hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism?
Yeah, so in that case, if we're talking about the thyroid gland, we know that there's a thyroid gland. We looked at it in lab, both macroscopic, microscopic. So if it's putting out too much hormone or too little, that's the thyroid gland doing it as well. Yeah, but any of the endocrine glands can do it and produce issues. So these slides here are just giving us examples of the control for endocrine secretion. This is humoral of the fluids stimulus. So I talked about glucose levels. Calcium levels in the body are also regulated humorally. We learned about this when we were going through our fluid and acid-base chapter. Calcium levels are regulated by two hormones, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. So they are constantly monitoring the blood for calcium levels. And for instance, if there is a low concentration of calcium in the blood, we will release parathyroid hormone from any of these four parathyroid glands on the posterior side of the thyroid. And that will work to bring up calcium levels in the blood, right? Reabsorbing in the kidney, kind of chewing up the bone a little bit and stuff like that. Neural stimulation. So neural control is where we have neurons going right to the endocrine gland and going bzz, bzz, releasing neurotransmitter and telling it when to release hormones. The adrenal medulla, the inside of the adrenal gland, is controlled directly by sympathetic nerve fibers going down to it. You may remember, or you may have purged it because there's only so much room in the brain. But in autonomic nervous system, when we're talking about those pathways, you had a pre-ganglionic cell and a post-ganglionic cell to make it all the way out to your target cell for sympathetic and parasympathetic, like sympathetic chains and stuff like that, right? So this adrenal medulla, they think evolutionarily that these are post-ganglionic fibers, that it's more neural in its origins. So this is a pre-ganglionic sympathetic neuron that is exiting the nervous system and going down to the inside of the medulla and telling those modified postganglionic neurons to release a chemical messenger. And because that chemical message goes into the blood, then this is considered endocrine. But we know epinephrine and norepinephrine are also neurotransmitters, right? So this counts as a type of neural control, where it's a neuron going to that endocrine gland, going bzz, bzz, tapping it physiologically, telling it it's time to release its hormone. We'll have a couple other examples of that as well. So that's neural control. A lot of our endocrine glands are controlled by hormones themselves. So while they release their own hormones, what controls their release of those hormones are hormones coming from another endocrine gland. Up there we see a zoom up of the pituitary gland. As we learned in lab, there's an anterior and a posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, the front part of it, if you will, puts out a number of hormones that their job is to go down to other endocrine glands and physiologically tap them and tell them when to release their hormones. So for instance, there is a hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary that's called the adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it goes to the adrenal cortex and tells the cells of the adrenal cortex when to release their hormone. There is another hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary. It's called thyroid stimulating hormone. That's it, pretty straightforward, right? So it tells the thyroid gland when to release thyroid hormone. So that is an example of hormonal control as well. So that's also probably one of those bolded exam objectives. We got to explain how the system is controlled, like usual, hormonal, neural, and humoral, right? The spelling is close to hormonal. That's the humors, where we're monitoring the fluids directly for particular chemicals. Okay. Now, for these hormones, as we release them into the bloodstream, like I said, generally they are going to be longer lasting, but they're not going to stay in there forever, right? Where do they go? How do we get rid of them? If you remember, in the neuromuscular junction and places like that, we had enzymes right there that help to get rid of them, right? So we release acetylcholine or something like that. We have acetylcholinesterase. That is right there in the synapse. That can degrade it and cause it to fall apart. And then also that neurotransmitter can just diffuse away from that cell so that it's not stimulating as well. So some of those same types of kind of inactivations occur here too. We have degrading enzymes that can degrade hormones. The kidneys, ultimately, for some of these smaller ones, can filter them out. And then also, they can be kind of taken out of circulation. Much like old red blood cells can be taken out of circulation in the liver. We know the liver has a series of blood vessels, like hepatic portal vein, that is taking extra blood to the liver to process things that are in the blood, like nutrients and waste products, etc., but also hormones. So they can take out these hormones and kind of inactivate them as well. So like we said, these hormones last in our system longer periods of time compared to neurotransmitters generally, and their effects also are longer lasting. So we're talking about seconds to hours to days or something like that in terms of their effects. So if you were on your way to school today and you were driving on the freeway and somebody started drifting over to your lane and almost hit you, you would feel that adrenaline rush, right? That might have effects for a period of time, like you are all kind of amped up and your heart rate's up and your breathing rate's up even after you got here and you parked your car, right? Because epinephrine and norepinephrine is going to be circulating around in the system for a little bit. Okay, so what we've done so far is the big picture type of stuff. All right, what are hormones? What are the chemical classes of hormones? How do they affect the cell? How can the cell modify its response in terms of upregulation, downregulation? What if we have more than one hormone that attaches to a cell? How can it respond? What type of interactive effects can we have? How are these different endocrine glands controlled as well? So big picture things about how the system works. Questions? Okay. So from there, we're going to do our tour, which means that we're going to be going through, we're going to visit each of the major endocrine organs and then discuss what hormones they put out and what those hormones do. Now, compared to lab, right, this is going to be a bigger list. We're going to see some overlap for sure for the ones that we learned in lab, those 10 or so that we learned in lab. But we'll also be learning a little bit more detail about them as well and other hormones. So I'll do a tour that way. But much like in lab, I can tell you, right, the bulk of the chapter is going to be this, like what's the endocrine gland, what's the hormone, what does it do, where's the target cell, etc. So in fact, as you are preparing and studying this particular chapter and how the system works, ironically enough, basic flashcards gives you a lot of the information for understanding the system. Name of the hormone on the front, where it comes from on the back, what does it do as well on the back side, right? That's the bulk of the information. All right, so we're starting with one of the endocrine glands that has the largest effects in the body because it puts out the most hormones compared to other endocrine glands in the body. So this is going to be the pituitary gland. And we know that the pituitary gland has a very special relationship with the hypothalamus. So it hangs right off of the hypothalamus. There's a little stalk called the infundibulum that connects it to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that receives lots of feedback, right? So it's connected to the thalamus, it's connected to the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, and it gets feedback in various ways. When we talked about CCK from the digestive system, cholecystokinin, gastrin, things like that, they go into the bloodstream. They have effect on their local target organs, but they also act as feedback mechanisms in terms of satiation and hunger and things like that. Hypothalamus is our hunger center, it's our temperature center, it's our thirst center, etc. So it is a lot of set points And so we need a lot of feedback to it, and it then needs to be able to respond. And it can respond in many ways through the endocrine. So hypothalamus is going to control our pituitary gland. We know that there are two main parts of the pituitary gland. What are those two main parts?
Anterior and posterior.
Anterior and posterior. Anterior, adenohypophysis. Posterior is going to be the neurohypophysis. That hypophysis is the part that means pituitary gland. So hypophysis is like this. Okay? So it's not hypothesis, it's hypophysis, like that. And so you just add adeno onto it, or neuro onto it for anterior and posterior, like that. But both of the different major parts of the pituitary gland are controlled by the hypothalamus. They're just controlled in different ways. So that makes it a bigger topic in terms of, okay, this endocrine gland puts out a lot of hormones, like 9 different hormones that we're going to learn, okay? So that makes it a big player in the endocrine system. But then also it has this special relationship with the hypothalamus. The two halves are both controlled by the hypothalamus in 2 different ways. So as we're going through these endocrine glands, much like we've seen in other chapters and systems and stuff like that, where we spend the most time, that's where you're going to expect the most questions on the exam as well. So pituitary gland, biggest one. A lot of questions having to do with the pituitary gland, okay? Other ones like parathyroid gland that puts out one hormone called parathyroid hormone, those are much easier, much simpler, only a few questions on things like that. Okay, so let's take a look at it. These are the parts of it as I had referenced previously. Technically, there's a little middle section called the pars intermedia, right, in the middleus, if you will. But we're kind of ignoring that for now. So this is a zoomed up version of what we're seeing, how it hangs off of the inferior surface of the brain right there. There's our thalamus up here. Here's our hypothalamus, just inferior to that. So there's our hypothalamus that we see right there. This is the infundibulum, the little cherry stem, if you will, that allows the connection between the hypothalamus and the thalamus. So we already discussed a little bit about this when we were going through it in lab, right? We saw that the 2 parts of the hypophysis of the pituitary gland look different in the microscope, right? The anterior part was darker, right? Anterior starts with A, dark, has A in it. It was darker because it's more glandular tissue. And so the anterior part, as glandular tissue, is going to, as endocrine gland, it's going to respond to hormones that are coming down from the hypothalamus, and so we have more of a hormonal control for the anterior part that we'll talk about. Meanwhile, the posterior part, we said in the microscope appears lighter because it is actually neural tissue. So in terms of the posterior part, we have neurons that will extend all the way down into the posterior pituitary, and those are going to be the neurons that are releasing hormones from there. Okay? So 2 different relationships with the hypothalamus, but controlled by the hypothalamus in either case, anterior and posterior. So we'll start with the anterior. It has more hormones, and as I mentioned, with the anterior, it is going to be, in essence, hormonally controlled. So what we have is neurons up here in the hypothalamus that will release little hormones into a wee little vascular system that just goes from here right downstairs to the anterior pituitary. It's not going too far, but still blood vessels, so they count as hormones. So up here, when you see all these H's in all these acronyms, those all stand for hormones. So when we need the anterior pituitary to put out a hormone, what we will do is we will, from the hypothalamus, put out a releasing hormone. Guess what? Give me some of that. Or an inhibiting hormone. Guess what? Stop doing that. Okay? So those are the different hormones that come from the hypothalamus and that stimulate the anterior pituitary. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different ones that come from the hypothalamus. They basically have the same name as the hormone that they are looking to stop or start release from the anterior pituitary. But that's how that works. That's how the control of the hypothalamus and works over the anterior pituitary. Okay, so let's look at that anterior pituitary in terms of the bulk of its hormones that are being created. All 6 of the hormones that are being released from the anterior pituitary, there's one extra one that we'll talk about, throw in there. All 6 of them are peptide hormones. So what does that mean? Are they lipid soluble or water soluble? So they're water soluble, right? Water soluble are going to be amine, peptide, protein based. So these are going to be great examples if you get that question saying, oh, let's discuss the two major chemical classes of hormones, which you're going to say, oh, water soluble, lipid soluble. Any of the ones from the anterior pituitary that we're going through, if you need to give an example of a water soluble hormone, you can use any of these. Okay? So that's nice to have it kind of categorized that way. Now, when we look at these, a lot of these water-soluble hormones, in fact, all of them are going to rely on the second messenger system. And then that cyclic AMP that we had seen as an example of a second messenger system, almost all of them, except for growth hormone, are going to use that system that we saw back there. And all of them but two are called tropic hormones. And what that means is that most of these hormones coming from the anterior pituitary are exerting hormonal control on other endocrine glands. A tropic hormone, and it's not trophic with an H in there, it's tropic. But it's kind of like, if you've ever talked about like a trophic systems in ecology, the whole predator and herbivore, right? The different levels of a feeding web, a food chain or whatever, those are called trophic levels. But these hormones, most of the hormones from the anterior pituitary do that. They are going down and communicating and commanding, if you will, other endocrine glands. So we have this whole relay, right? We have hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary to another endocrine gland, and then that endocrine gland is communicating with some target cells. So when we were talking about like hyposecretion, hypersecretion, stuff like that, with that many management levels, you can imagine if anything goes wrong along that axis, if you will, then there can be a problem. And it's hard to track what the problem is. Is it a problem with the brain, with the hypothalamus? Is it a problem with the anterior pituitary? Is it a problem with the responding endocrine organ? Or is it a problem with the target cells, that they're not getting the message? It's hard to say. It's hard to diagnose. Okay. So these are the hormones that we're going to be looking at coming out of the anterior pituitary. Now, luckily, most of our hormones have a very descriptive name, and they give you an idea about where they're going or what they're doing. It's kind of like when we're doing skeletal muscles. There's usually some sort of a hint in the name about its function or something like that. So we see growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. What do you think prolactin does? Go milk. That's it. That's really what it does, right? So that one is almost everything you need to know about it. It's right in that short little one-word name. Okay. So growth hormone. Remember with these, we need to know the name of the hormone, we need to know where it comes from, and, right, if there's a particular region, like anterior pituitary, that's going to be important. So we have to be specific. And what the effect is, like what's the target cell, and what the effect is. Some hormones are very, very specific in terms of where the target cells are, and they affect one other cell or something like that. But growth hormone is one of those where it's super diverse, okay? It affects many, many different cells in the body, almost most cells in the body. I have listed in here in the slides about the specific cells where these different anterior pituitary hormones come from, but I wouldn't worry about that, okay? But the point is, so when this says it comes from somatotropic cells, I wouldn't worry about that, okay? But the point is that if we have 6 different hormones coming from the anterior pituitary, it's not just one cell that's super diverse and like, I can make this protein, and I can make this protein, and I can make this protein or hormone. It is little islands or groups of cells. Each little group of cells puts out a different hormone. Okay, just like anterior pituitary and posterior put out different hormones, there are different groups of cells that will put out different hormones. So the somatotropic cells, for example, are the ones that put out growth hormone. Somatotropic, when we see soma, that means body, like a soma, the soma of the neuron is the body. And growth hormone, by the way, has many effects, many target cells around the body. So most cells in the body will light up or respond to growth hormone. It has direct effects on metabolism. Remember, when we say metabolism, we're talking about the series of chemical equations or chemical reactions that occur inside of a cell that are life-sustaining. Whether we are using energy or releasing energy or building, breaking things down or building things up, that's what we're talking about in terms of metabolic reactions. And the speed at which we conduct those is one of the things that growth hormone controls. And as you can imagine, it does have effects on growth in the body. Not only, okay, baby to toddler to, right, continuing infant to teenager and on up, but also growth in terms of, well, I also need to increase the size of a particular organ at a particular time in response to actions that are occurring. So in terms of metabolism, before we get to growth, metabolism, like we said, there are certain reactions or actions that are glucose sparing so that we can tell certain cells to hold on to glucose for later on in case we need it. It also will tell the liver to break down glycogen to release that glucose as well. And it can release fatty acids that are stored in certain tissues so that we can use those as a source of fuel as well. So if we are going to be going through a growth period, so say, again, you're going from a baby to a toddler and you're going to be supporting yourself as opposed to just laying there like a lump, a lot of your cells are going to need to grow and get bigger and get stronger, etc. And so growth hormone can help to facilitate that. So those are some of the direct actions of growth hormone, and a variety of cells in the body can do that. But indirect actions can also tell certain organs like the liver, skeletal muscles, and bones, a lot of these organs that are considered reserves, it can tell them to kind of mobilize their reserves as well, right? So we mobilize those reserves so we can start telling those cells to enlarge and divide, etc. So we have a lot of targets in the body that might be things that you would obviously think of for growth: bone and skeletal muscle, right? For growth hormone, you can actually see a surge in growth hormone, certainly between different life stages, where your bones are getting bigger and your muscles are getting bigger and stuff like that. But you can also see surges in growth hormone even when there's an increased demand on a day-to-day basis. So if you were to, now that you just had an exam, maybe you're going to get back to the gym this week for a little bit before it gets to finals. Maybe. I don't know. And if you do that, and you go to the gym, you work out those muscles, you put more demand on your muscles are going to be, especially if you do it repetitively, their muscles are going to be like, oh gosh, we're going again. Here we go. We got to start growing a bit because all of a sudden we're going to be walking or running more, or we're going to be lifting heavy things. So we need to be bigger so we can lift heavy things, right? Growth hormone will surge even after going to the gym because it's going to tell those muscles. That's how the muscles know that it's time to respond, right? Stretch receptors going off and stuff like that at the joints and the muscles. Feedback to places like the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus says, oh boy, we're going to be lifting heavy things again. Let's make those muscles a little bit bigger. We need to make the muscles bigger. Muscles attach to move bones, right, via tendons. So the bones need to be stronger too. If you don't have strong bones, then in theory it doesn't happen. But if the bones don't grow in response as well to the muscles growing, you can actually damage the bone because the muscle is so strong, the bone can actually break, right? Or detach from it, etc. Yeah. Okay. So lots of different cells that can respond to growth hormone. Some of the main ones will be like our bone cells, our different osteocytes and stuff like that, as well as muscle cells, myocytes. So what we're seeing here is, again, some of our different responses to growth. And so growth hormone is going to be a primary factor that can cause growth periods. So for instance, in the graph in the lower right-hand corner here, we see some life periods from birth up to age 20. Some of the times when you, as a whole individual, are growing. And there are two main surges in that we see. There's a postnatal growth spurt and a pubertal growth spurt, right? Two times where, whoa, I'm getting much bigger. Let's put a little notch on the wall, right? That first one where you go from a baby to a toddler, see how steep that curve is? There's a lot of growth going on there because the body, again, is having to support itself as opposed to just lay there as a lump. So that growth spurt there is controlled by growth hormone. The second one that you get, right, in your teenage years and stuff like that, at puberty, that's more controlled by sex hormones. increases in there, right? So we talked about like testosterone and how it has effect on, anabolism and things like that, building. Now, while hormones can tell these cells to do it, a cell can only respond if it has the materials to do so, if it has the ability to do so, if it is healthy, if you will, at the time. So there are a variety of different factors that can affect how much growth can occur, how much kind of that signal is received and response we get. So genetics comes into play for sure, right? So if you look at your parents and how tall they are and your kind of closest relatives, you're probably going to be in that range as well. There's individual variation for sure. We're like, that person ended up short. What happened there, right? But if you have parents that are especially short, both mom and dad, you're probably not going to be playing for the NBA. There's just genetics involved, right? Genes that get activated and don't get activated, stuff like that. So that's an aspect of it. Adequate diet. So those cells are going to be getting larger, dividing and things like that. It takes energy. So if you're not eating enough, that's one of the things. If you're going to work out a lot, you're burning more calories, so you need to supply your body with more calories. If you don't do that, the stimulus is there. Hey, we need to grow, but I don't have the energy to do so, right? So that can affect growth, even though we see this stimulus coming. And then disease and stress. We all know that. So if you see people that as a kid had a childhood disease, their body was having to defend itself against that disease or something like that, rather than routing that energy to growth and metabolism. So oftentimes their overall body form is stunted maybe. They may be skinnier or not as tall or something like that because they weren't able to respond. So there's a lot of different things that go into growth besides just growth hormone says bing, 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 get bigger, right? Otherwise, all of us would be like 7 feet tall. Maybe.
Gymnasts actually have a really hard. Oh, sorry. Did someone
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Gymnasts have a really hard time with their hormones, and a lot of them are almost prepubescent in size, like smaller, skinnier statue, especially for gymnastics.
Yeah.
And it has to do with their training.
Yeah, for sure, right? So for sports and things like that, especially gymnastics, there's a lot of strength training that goes on there. So you can imagine, like we were saying, when you're going to the gym, you're getting little pulses and stuff like that, but they start really early training, right? If they're going to be really successful, and it's a lot of strength training. And so we need to have big muscles and we need to have strong bones. That means we need to reinforce them this way in width and diameter, not this way. So that's probably why, right, there's an influence then in terms of stature. They have very broad muscles and musculature and stature and stuff like that, but generally not as tall because we're having to reinforce things to make them thicker, right? So like trees or whatever, right? Trees that are growing in an area where there's lots of wind or lots of other forces upon them are not going to be super tall. They're going to be super thick so that they can withstand those forces as well. Yeah. That's a good example. Okay. So that was growth hormone. Now, growth hormone is interesting, though. If you do have a lot of it being released, or a little bit, that can affect, and that's where you get kind of extreme. So hypersecretion, hyposecretion can lead to can lead to gigantism. That's where you do get people, for whatever reason, they may actually have a tumor associated with their anterior pituitary, associated with these, or with their hypothalamus, that may affect how much growth hormone is being released. And if that occurs, where we have a lot being released early on during those early growth periods, then you get a lot of growth throughout those responsive periods of your life. If it's later on, so say growth hormone levels increase after your age 20, when a lot of your epiphyseal plates have sealed and stuff like that, then even though there's a stimulus there, the bone is not going to get that because it's basically done, it's in a maintenance phase. The muscle is now kind of a little bit less responsive, but the bone structure won't respond. And so the only bones that you can get responding if you have a surge in growth hormone is bones of the hands, feet, and face. And so people that have a tumor associated with their anterior pituitary and they get growth hormone being released later on, they have really accentuated like cheekbones and jawline and things like that, as well as maybe really big hands and feet. Those are the bones that can still respond in terms of bony growth, as opposed to like the main limb bones and things like that. And then, of course, hyposecretion of growth hormone can lead to pituitary dwarfism, where you get people that may be 4 feet under instead. And so here's some examples from history. So you see a woman of normal stature on the left there, and somebody with gigantism and dwarfism as full-grown adults. Quite different.
There's many ways to have the dwarfism trait, right?
Right, yeah. So this is just due to hyposecretion of growth hormone, but there are other mechanisms, like we said, that can affect growth. So whether it's muscular or bone or something like that, that's part of it. Yeah. Okay, so that was our first one. That one was a little bit more complex because it's in the name, it influences growth, but we have to be able to say, okay, yeah, but exactly how does it do that? So you need to be able to talk about whatever, muscle cells or the liver or bone cells or something like that and how it influences their activities. Okay, next one's a little bit easier because it's thyroid stimulating hormone. We only have a little bit of time, but thyroid stimulating hormone goes down to the thyroid gland. That's very easy. And it tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, as you see it here, so TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. That's what comes from the anterior pituitary. T3 and T4, those are different chemical variants of thyroid hormone. So the direct effect, the target tissue is the thyroid gland, particularly those follicular cells. You recognize this from the microscope slide, right? Those follicular cells which produce thyroid hormone. And it gets them to release thyroid hormone. So this is an example of hormonal control. So that's the direct effect. Now the indirect effect is our metabolic rate would go up. But that's the effect of thyroid hormone itself. So thyroid stimulating hormone gets the thyroid to release more of its thyroid hormone. Okay. So that is the indirect effect where we see a change in metabolism there. All right, so I'm going to have to stop there because we ran out of time. But what we're doing is we are touring through the pituitary. We're in the middle of anterior pituitary with its 6 or 7, depending on who you talk to, hormones that we're going to discuss with it. We'll then discuss the posterior part, and then we'll keep moving southward and talk about other endocrine things. Just laying it out. What's the hormone? What's the target cell? What does it do? Okay? So the sooner, I mean, you don't have to make flashcards, but it's a very easy way to nail down the bulk of the material. The sooner you start making those, the easier it is, right? The sooner you can start flipping through them, just like when you were doing muscles before as well, right? So think about doing that before we meet next time, as we'll continue on to endocrine systems.